I was regarded at Harvard Business School as being a communist.
A brief is setting out your ambition. The brief from the Pope was make them believe.
Innovation is ideas having sex.
It takes the same amount of energy to try and do something great as it does to justify something average.
If I was a CMO and I'd give them a 3-word brief, make us famous.
Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of WFA's Better Marketing. As I was pondering who we should talk to this time, it struck me that the world continues to be full of fake news and it continues to be full of dangerous places to put your advertising. And today I'm delighted to welcome Gordon Crovitz, who's the CEO of NewsGuard, has a storied career in journalism, and he's setting out to make news a safer place for all advertisers. Anyway, Gordon, welcome. Please tell us your story. It'll be a surprise for everybody.
David, thank you so much for having me. You're certainly right. The world is full of misinformation. NewsGuard was founded 5 years ago to try to counter misinformation, as we put it, on behalf of news consumers, brands, and democracies. And what we thought was needed was some sense of the general trustworthiness of news and information sources. For consumers, impossible to tell in a Facebook feed or even a search result, is this news story from a reliable source? Have I ever heard of this brand? NewsGuard has a staff of dozens of journalistically trained analysts, and we've rated for trustworthiness all of the news and information sources that account for 95% of engagement in the countries in which we operate. That's the US, UK, Canada, Germany, France, Italy, Austria, and we're just now launching in Australia and New Zealand. So what that means is for news consumers, if they have access to our data through Microsoft or another of our partners, they'll see ratings right away in every news story. For brands, we have exclusion lists as well as inclusion lists of high-quality news sites. So it's become possible now for brands that are focused on responsible advertising and their own brand safety to avoid the thousands and thousands of highly profitable misinformation websites that live for unintentional advertising from the best brands. And working with ComScore, we estimate that there's 2.6 billion US dollars worth of advertising unintentionally going to these websites every year.
2.6 billion.
It's an extraordinary number when you think about the amount of advertising these days supporting news and information sites. That's a large percentage. We're trying to steer that 2.6 billion to trustworthy news sites and away from healthcare hoax sites and Russian disinformation sites. But think about it another way, which is that 2.6 billion is actually a small percentage of all of the programmatic advertising. It's just an extraordinary number, and it accounts for why there's so much misinformation on the internet. It's a big business. It's a profitable business. And we found thousands of websites that have no other source of support than getting ads from big-name British, American, European brands whose ads are appearing there because they were placed programmatically. It's not like the CEO or the CMO ever wanted to support those kinds of websites.
Can we step back a little bit in your career? Because obviously when you started out in journalism, and as I said earlier, you've a storied career, and I know you were the publisher of the Wall Street Journal, and I know you still write. But how you had to verify and check news. Can we just talk about that? Because there are many of our viewers and listeners who won't remember those days, probably too young.
I appreciate that. And I spent almost 30 years at the Wall Street Journal. I was with the original group that started the European edition of the Wall Street Journal in Brussels. I won't tell you exactly the year, but quite a while ago. And having grown up at the Wall Street Journal, I grew up, of course, quite focused on protecting that brand as my peers at the Times of London or the FT or the Telegraph or the Guardian also would have done. And at that time, readers and advertisers certainly knew the brands because there weren't that many of them. This was the print and broadcast era. The example I give in the States is, in those days, somebody might go to the local newsagent and say, I'd like a copy of the Philadelphia Inquirer, but I don't want the National Enquirer. National Enquirer is our news of the world.
Yeah.
And people completely understood that, and there was no confusion. But early on in the internet, that was no longer true. And there were malign actors that would launch websites with names like bbc.info, made to look like the BBC. We've discovered networks of local news sites that literally took the names of Victorian-era newspapers in the UK that are now defunct, but sound like well-established newspapers, and launched websites publishing made-up crime stories, made-up stories of one kind or another in order to generate traffic. And, of course, the Silicon Valley platforms, Facebook, even the search engines, their business model has always been, let's maximize engagement. We're designed to maximize the time people spend, the pages that they look at. That equates to revenue. They're not designed for accuracy or truth or any of those old-fashioned values that readers and brands actually still expect, but that the internet on its own is not delivering.
And I remember in a WFA council meeting when we were first shown, I think it was a jihadi website that was carrying advertising, that whole notion of brand safety really popped to the forefront and became a big thing. Now, relatively speaking, especially in the internet age, that's a long time ago, and things are marginally better. But, you know, I'm going to go without naming names here. Do you think the platforms have been doing enough to provide the same kind of service of, you know, brand safety and real news and ways of avoiding their platforms being manipulated?
None of them has taken responsibility for this problem in an effective way. Google, its DSP, continues to serve ads on some of the worst disinformation sites in the world. If you go to Pravda, Russian website, you'll find ads supported by Google and many others. Internet companies were born at a time in the 1990s when in the U.S., Congress and the White House had agreed, for good reason, to limit the liability of the digital platforms. The commercial internet was just starting out in the 1990s. In the States, we passed a law that essentially held the platforms immune from harms that have since become so obvious. And so these companies were born in an era of immunity, and unsurprisingly, they act as if they're immune because they are. So there's had to grow up around those platforms other solutions. The GARM standards, of course, are a great aid, and misinformation was recently added to those standards, which is fantastic. But it's up to brands themselves, ad tech companies, supply-side platforms, we work with many of them, ad agencies, we work with many of them as well, IPG, Publicis, Omnicom. But at the end of the day, it comes down to CEOs and CMOs who increasingly are concerned about, I would say, three things. One, they really don't want their ads supporting terrible healthcare hoax sites and Russian disinformation sites. We found more than 1,000 brands supporting misinformation sites. It's not one or two, it's well over 1,000. It's virtually every brand that you can think of has had this problem. It's an endemic problem. So one, the brands don't want their ads supporting those sites. Two, they want to have a good return on their investment. And we now have numerous pieces of evidence, including a case study, showing that advertising on terrible, low-quality websites is a terrible investment. Our brands using NewsGuard are getting CPMs almost 10% less and much higher engagement rates by advertising on quality news sites. And the third issue, and one I think that has become one that people are more and more aware of, is that journalism is important to all of our democracies. And support for journalism is historically been driven to some large degree by advertising. And yet there are now thousands of high-quality news sites that are getting no programmatic advertising. And the reason for that is until brands recently had the option of excluding at the domain level, simply saying, I don't want to be on any of the Russian disinformation sites or healthcare hoax sites, until services like ours came around, the solution that people were choosing was blacklisting based on keywords. And there are, in many cases, thousands of keywords against which no ads will appear. Unfortunately, those keywords include COVID and gay and lesbian and black and other keywords where ad agencies and others have said, this might be controversial, let's not have any ads run against it. But as a result, sites serving those communities, black community, the gay community, are essentially being boycotted by advertisers, and nobody can intend that. So we have an inclusion list that introduces to advertisers thousands of local news sites, sites serving black community, in the States, the Hispanic community, South Asian community, LGBTQ plus communities, all of which desperately need the advertising support.
And actually that whole truth of advertising, which is, there's content, but there's context, can only benefit from that kind of inclusion list. Are you seeing traction there? Is that growing? Because obviously for the sites themselves, this has got to be good news as well.
Yeah, certainly there are sites that never got programmatic advertising from blue chip advertisers, from big brands, and suddenly they're seeing ads for great brands, Starbucks or Bank of America, brands that had never used the sites before. I do want to say one thing about the contextual approach to this issue, that is using keywords to block ads. I'm old enough, David, to remember the rules for the print Wall Street Journal when it came to contextual advertising. Yeah. Our rule at the Wall Street Journal was if we ran a news article about a plane crash and the ad of an airline appeared next to it, that advertiser would get a free ad if the crash involved that airline. That was it. That was all of contextual advertising. And I think what's grown up is a technological solution, keyword blocking, in search of a problem. News stories that happen to mention COVID or happen to mention black or happen to mention gay, there's no reason in the world to think that those are bad places to have ads. People are engaged when they're reading news relevant to them from high-quality sources. So at NewsGuard, we hope that the ability now for brands to say, I want to support these high-quality sites. I do not want to support the thousands and thousands of low-quality sites, hoax sites in many cases. And I will do that by enabling advertising onto those high-quality sites and keep them off the others. It would make for a much healthier source of revenue for journalism, and it would end what has essentially been an unintended boycott of high-quality sites, even as, through programmatic advertising, billions of dollars have ended up supporting terrible websites.
And what about, just to change gear slightly. The fake news that we are seeing around the world and its impact on politics and its impact on extremism. And with your journalistic hat on, is NewsGuard helping stop that as well? I mean, are you helping put the brakes on it?
Yeah, we have, in addition to our ratings business, so we rate domains, we rate linear TV programming, we're in the process of rating CTV and OTT and podcasts. In addition to that product, we have another product which is used by some social media platforms and by defense and intelligence agencies and democracies to try to identify hostile information operations, information warfare. That's disinformation from countries like Russia and China. We have a product called our Misinformation Fingerprints, which is the largest catalog of all of the top examples of misinformation and hoaxes on all the platforms. And we make that available through licensing to the platform so that they can identify false narratives and to others. We have well over 1,000 of those. We add them every day. They're from all kinds of sources. One of the big categories, of course, is Russian disinformation about the war in Ukraine. We've identified 365 different publishers promoting false narratives about Russia's war in Ukraine, and well over 100 significant false narratives. These false narratives often start on small websites of unclear ownership and control, but that look like they are often used as the provenance for Russian disinformation. And then it's picked up on the well-known Russian sites like RT and Sputnik, and then occasionally picked up by well-meaning sites that assume there must be some truth to it when there's not.
Yeah. Yeah, because here I'm sure you'll have the equivalent in the States. You'll be very familiar with Private Eye here, and every week when Private Eye is published, there's a little section which shows the unfortunate placement of programmatic ads alongside a news story. And I won't give any examples, but I was always, back in my agency days, pre-internet, a big fan of topical advertising, where you could use a piece of news to the advantage of a brand and get some smart placement. And of course, that's possible today as well. Difficult to do, but when done, can be done brilliantly. And I've seen some great examples of that. So, I don't think per se we should be having these problems. They just need addressing more rigorously. And in that regard, what's your view of the likelihood of regulation coming the way of everybody to help solve this problem? Because, the WFA, we're big fans of self-regulation, and the spirit of GARM shows that as well, which is people should be fixing this problem. They shouldn't be forced to fix it. They should be fixing it because it's the right thing to do. But are you anticipating regulation?
I also, and NewsGuard generally, we are journalists, so we are in favor of free speech, and we don't censor anything. We're against censorship, and generally in favor of self-regulation for all the reasons that you listed. The complication here is that with regard to the digital platforms, they were granted immunity from basic common law obligations 25 years ago. And it's made all of these problems much more difficult to solve. So imagine if chemical companies were exempt from liability from the known harms that they were causing, that they could spill chemicals into the Thames and not be held accountable. There'd be a lot of chemicals spilled into the Thames in that world. And I believe that's where we are with the digital platforms. So I don't think of it so much as a need to regulate as a need to simply hold the digital platforms to the same basic obligations to protect their users, including the brands, from the known harms that they're causing. We are a member, we were invited by the European Commission to be a signatory to the Code of Practice on Disinformation. And one of the provisions of that code is a commitment by all the signatories, including all the major platforms, no longer to support advertising on what the code refers to as persistent publishers of disinformation. Those would be publishers on our exclusion list. I think that's actually a quite helpful process. The platforms fear regulation. That's why they signed on to voluntary codes like the Code of Practice. Whether they'll take effective steps or not is to be determined. But I think they understand that they've created a toxic environment for readers and for brands, and that if they don't do something, regulation is highly likely.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's another dynamic, isn't there? Here we are in the first year of them experiencing shareholder pressure. Let's put it like that, because their stock is not what it used to be in every regard. And I think these issues hopefully will add to them really taking the issue a bit more rigorously forward than they have. I'm not saying they haven't done things, they have. You can tell how carefully we tread around this at the WFA, because we're trying to encourage them to make the world a better, safer place. But faster would be good.
Yeah, I mean, we're all familiar with the heroic efforts by several big brands, including stopping advertising on YouTube and other platforms in the hopes that there would be improvements. And there have been some improvements. Ads no longer run against terrorist content or pornography. The problem is the platforms are perhaps uniquely unsuited to determine, is this a generally trustworthy website or an untrustworthy website? They don't want that responsibility. They don't take that responsibility. That's why you'll see Google's DSP supporting all kinds of misinformation and disinformation websites. But somebody has to exercise some judgment. And if the platforms feel unable to exercise that judgment, and they are not trusted by readers or brands, people have to look to third parties. Our efforts and efforts of others give brands some options and some tools to use effectively to clean up their experience with the platforms, whether or not the platforms are cooperating.
Yeah, because obviously I'm not sure whether to call it a grey area, but let's go with grey area for the avoidance of doubt. In newspapers, there has always been that section that is basically opinion. And it's clearly labelled, and it might be clearly labelled that because I have this set of beliefs, here's my opinion of that particular subject. I find that murkily ordered in the internet as well, because there's, the big fan of freedom of speech. Everybody should have a right to their opinions, but they should be carefully billed as opinions, not as fact. And obviously, some of the stuff that was said about the US election would really highlight that issue, and that it's still being said, even though it's been proven to be nonsense. How do you see that?
I think that's a great point. One of our 9 criteria as we rate news and information websites is whether they separate news and opinion in a responsible manner. And our exclusion list, many brands will say, I just don't want to advertise on a site that doesn't separate news and opinion in the way you've described, David. And it's quite common. When I was at the Wall Street Journal, I grew up on the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal. When I was publisher, I tried a few times to identify brands that might want to advertise against opinion. I tried to make the argument, yeah, it's controversial, but, give it a try. Very few takers, and I understand why. Brands, it's rare that brands, run to embrace controversy. That's not really how brands think about their best marketing. So in the old print days, one rarely saw print advertising on the opinion pages. And you don't see much advertising in opinion magazines for the same reason. Those are reader supported for the most part. So on the internet, brands now have the option of saying, I don't want to support news and information sites that fail that single criterion, even if everything else is okay. I just don't want to end up appearing alongside opinion. That was never my intent.
All right, Gordon. Listen, can I first of all thank you for getting up at this extraordinary early hour and looking so sharp and being so sharp. And secondly, for doing what you're doing. I mean, great to see NewsGuard making the world a safer place for advertisers. And I wish you every success as you continue to do that. But what can I ask you? What should CMOs, what should our audience have at the top of their mind? What should they be doing around this? Given, obviously, you'd like them to sign up for NewsGuard. What else?
Yeah, I think we encourage CMOs to preempt the question from the CEO of, wait a second, don't we look at all the news and information sites where our ads are appearing? CEOs still believe that the CMO has vetted where the brands appear. Yeah. And it's the nature of programmatic advertising that is simply not true. So our encouragement to CMOs is, even with programmatic advertising, there's now the opportunity to use exclusion lists and inclusion lists to make sure that the brand is only appearing on the highest quality news and information sources, but also that it's supporting local news and news serving underrepresented communities and meeting the obligations that so many companies have taken on to support those efforts.
Okay. Well, Gordon, thank you again. A really, really enjoyable chat. And as I say, good luck.
David, thank you so much to the WFA and to you for your attention and work in this area.
Well, thanks very much, Gordon. Subject very dear to my heart because I do think all of our customers, consumers, users deserve a safer space to receive the messages of all of our advertisers. And with that, I'm looking forward to seeing you all very soon in Istanbul. Take care.